Individuals with severe trauma or depression will sometimes present with high-energy, hyper-expressive outward behavior. They become loud and engaging, only to abruptly crash into complete physical and emotional stillness. This extreme performative energy is frequently dismissed as simple attention-seeking, leading many to assume the underlying depression is manageable or even superficial. This behavior is a biological imperative. The brain deploys an emergency neurochemical survival strategy to prevent total nervous system collapse. When emotional regulation fails, the nervous system defaults to dissociation. The high-energy performance is a tool designed to breach that disconnected baseline. We can trace this process through the empirical data, starting with the initial chemical spike, following the resulting cognitive overload, and concluding with the inevitable failure of the autonomic nervous system. Clinical success depends on treating this state as a measurable crisis of finite cognitive bandwidth and autonomic mechanics. We will map the patient's state across 3 physiological tiers: brain connectivity, neurochemistry, and the autonomic state. The cycle begins when emotional experiences reach an intensity that overwhelms the brain's regulatory capacity. The nervous system responds to this overwhelm by shifting into dissociation. The individual experiences depersonalization, a sense of detachment from their own body, and derealization, where the world appears distant and unreal. This dissociation has a specific neurological signature. Looking at Tier 1, brain connectivity, we see hyperconnectivity within the default mode, central executive, and salience networks. Severe distress causes the default mode network to lose integration with extrastriate regions, fragmenting autobiographical memory. Psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott described the healthy state as a sense of going-on being. This DMN disruption terminates that sense of continuity. Dissociation acts as a necessary emotional anesthesia, though it leaves the patient fundamentally disconnected from their environment. To penetrate this deep emotional anesthesia, the brain requires an immediate, high-potency pharmacological intervention. Institutional data indicates that high-energy behavioral displays, such as performative humor, trigger a rapid neurochemical release that acts as a natural stress reliever. In our second tier, neurochemistry, these displays cause a sudden spike in dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins. Simultaneously, the act causes cortisol levels to plummet. This event functions as a performative defibrillator, momentarily suppressing the stress hormone to buoy the mood. Clinicians frame this mechanism as a performative oscillation. This oscillation allows the individual to display and process their traumata from a safe distance, avoiding direct confrontation with overwhelming emotions. The brain uses the performance to self-administer a precisely regulated dose of emergency medication, providing the metabolic force needed to stay functional. This survival strategy eventually hits a psychological trap known as hyper-reflexivity. Hyper-reflexivity is a rapid analytical loop of cognitive fusion and rumination. It begins at layer 1, primal distress, the biological drive to escape overwhelming pain. This drive is met by layer 2, interpersonal conditioning, an internalized critical voice interrogating the individual's suffering. This voice often stems from childhood emotional neglect. A child who experiences indifference from caregivers will often internalize that critical stance to preserve the bond. Layer 3, metacognitive friction, occurs when the conscious mind attempts to defend its actual agony against this self-directed gaslighting. The resulting internal dialogue is a recursive nightmare. The mind registers pain, only for the inner voice to accuse the person of faking it for sympathy. To prove the pain is real, the individual escalates the performance. This escalation only reinforces the internal accusation that the behavior is staged. The mind becomes its own prosecutor, judge, and executioner, using its own survival strategy as evidence of manipulation. Prefrontal cognitive resources are strictly finite. This hyper-reflexive loop rapidly consumes all available processing bandwidth. When this bandwidth is exhausted, the brain loses the ability to regulate itself. Our third tier maps this crisis against the window of tolerance, the zone of optimal physiological arousal. As the brain frantically attempts to authenticate its pain, the system spikes into sympathetic hyperarousal. It hits a ceiling of total cognitive exhaustion. This state is unsustainable. The autonomic nervous system undergoes an instant drop to a profound parasympathetic shutdown. This crash manifests as a flat affect, numbness, and a visceral ache in the chest. Data shows that major depression is characterized by a measurable loss of parasympathetic tone. This leaves the heart vulnerable to sympathetic excitation and increases cardiovascular risk. The subsequent depressive collapse is a biomechanically inevitable event, a blown fuse meant to protect the system from total overload. This closed recursive loop, primal pain, triggers the neurochemical spike of the performance, leading to cognitive exhaustion and autonomic shutdown, eventually returning to dissociation. The survival behavior developed in childhood to secure safety now triggers the metacognitive friction that destroys the adult nervous system. Clinical intervention must target the cognitive attentional syndrome, addressing the underlying dysregulation rather than criticizing the outward behavior. Support systems must validate performative behavior as a genuine survival mechanism. This validation is the primary tool to silence the critical inner voice. Removing that internal accusation preserves cognitive bandwidth, allowing the autonomic nervous system to gradually return to its optimal baseline. Resolving this paradox requires radical compassion. Meeting the inner critic with scientific validation is the only way to stabilize a failing nervous system.